Most of the meteorites that hit Earth, 90%, are iron-nickel based. But there's about 10% of these meteorites that are silica-based. In other words, they're glass. And the silica-based meteorites have inclusions of heavier metal, so that the heat and pressure of entering the atmosphere infuse the silica with fused or fusion-based heavy metals: iridium, rhodium, platinum, palladium, the PMG group of metals. Now, the more platinum and palladium and iridium you have in a meteorite, the more the color of the glass becomes dark red-purple. So, starting all the way back at Egypt, if we just simply look for meteoric glass, then suddenly the whole secret of alchemy becomes very clear. We find in the Old Kingdom, the original early dynasties of Egypt, that there was an enormous amount of gold that seems to have no source. Unless you want to speculate that the Egyptians were sailing to North America and far distant places for sources of gold, then we have to say they made it, because there is no rich gold ores immediately in the Nile Valley. And there's no way to account for the amount of gold that the Old Kingdom used and had, unless you want to speculate they got it from the Americas or that they made it. Now, one of the interesting things is that up until the 19th century, every apothecary shop in Europe had mummy dust. And mummy dust was sort of part of the universal panacea. You would eat mummy dust, drink mummy dust, and it would have a salutary effect on your immune system. It was a cure for lots of things. Now, in that mummy dust was gold dust, and a very strange form of gold, a monatomic gold that had sort of popped like a popcorn kernel. Now, no one really understood why that was or where it came from until you start looking for the origins of mummification. And the Old Kingdom started using a certain type of natron or salt that could only be found in one place in the western desert. And guess what? That's one spot where they found all the salt for mummification in the early dynasties was also the location of a yellow silica meteorite. In fact, some of the Egyptian glass, some of the Egyptian faience was actually made using this yellow meteoric glass. But as part of that meteor, there were other trace minerals, and at the center of the huge expanse where the yellow glass meteorite landed are the natron beds. So using the natron, the salt from this meteoric glass, to mummify, and then over time, the very subtle energies coming from the priests who were doing the rituals and coming from the energy of the bodies that were being mummified, it transmuted the heavier elements in the mummy, in the body, into monatomic gold, mummy dust. Now, very early on in the Old Kingdom, the sacred scientists of Egypt discovered the basic principle of how to use this meteoric glass to transform other metals into gold. Now, this idea remained, but the secret slowly over time was lost until you get to the founding of alchemy in the 1st century AD in Alexandria. They still had the principles, but they had forgotten what the prima materia was. In other words, the idea that this was connected to heavy metal infused meteoric glass had completely disappeared. So other than a few transmutation that we find in the 1st and 2nd century, there's a gap in which we don't find any documented, any really hard evidence for transmutation for roughly 800 or 900 years. Then something very curious happened. If you remember your Bible, when Abram switched from being Abram, worshiping the God Most High, which was Draco, to worshiping Yahweh and becoming Abraham, an event happened. Abraham sacrificed unto Yahweh, and through the middle of his sacrifices passed a flaming torch. And the tradition is that flaming torch is the meteoritic stone that's encapsulated in the Kaaba in Mecca. Now, in the early 10th century, a group of followers of the family of the Prophet called the Fatimids, after Muhammad's daughter Fatima, came to power all across North Africa and in Egypt. And the Fatimids had a little splinter group called the Ismailis. They're still around. And they were pretty radical folks. So in the early 10th century, the Ismailis destroyed the current version of the Kaaba and removed the stone. And they gave part of that stone to the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo. And about 60 years later, the stone was put back into the Kaaba when it was rebuilt. Now, the only problem is the volume of that stone had shrunk by 60% between when the Ismailis put it out and when it was officially put back. And in the later rebuildings of the Kaaba, you can clearly see that earlier it used to be huge and now it's really small. So what happened to the missing 60% of this extremely rich in platinum, palladium, iridium, rhodium meteorite? What happened to it? Well, apparently the Caliph of Cairo, the Fatimid Caliph, kept most of it, and he passed it on to his son and his grandson. And his grandson, El-Harun the Mad Caliph, about 100 years before the Crusades, apparently got a little bit too fond of it and didn't understand how to work it, and it drove him crazy. And the tradition is he buried his most secret treasures under the temple, the remains of Herod's temple in Jerusalem, and walked east into the desert and disappeared. Now, one of the things El-Harun the Mad did was he declared the entire city of Jerusalem was off limits to Christians. Then a few years after his time, the Turks swept out of Central Asia, conquered the whole region, drove the Fatimids back, and they also continued the idea that Christians could visit the city, but they couldn't visit the holy places. And slowly over time, this became the cause of the Crusades. So the first crusade, wading through blood up to the horses' fetlocks, conquered Jerusalem. And the first thing the new king of Jerusalem did was install a group of very strange knights in the ruins of Herod's temple, supposedly to protect travelers, although there were only a dozen of them, so how could they possibly protect travelers? And what they really seemed to have been doing was carrying on archaeological excavations under the temple. 20 years down the line, they made a discovery. And they took that discovery back to Europe, and they collected the greatest Kabbalistic scholars of that age to analyze the find. And within 30 years, we're off and running again with authentic, validated, seen in front of everybody transmutations. So, the source of these new transmutations would seem to be the information and the material found under the temple. And as we begin to track this, we begin to see that they had the prima materia, and there may even be a little bit of it left, buried under Notre Dame Cathedral. That's another story. But they didn't know how to make it. They didn't know how to get any more. They knew how to use the meteoric glass they had to produce the powder of projection and the Philosopher's Stone, and therefore turn lower metals into gold, but they didn't know how to make it. They didn't know how to make the powder of projection. So over time, it was lost.